Welcome back, and I hope that you're still having fun in this project. Now, the next part of this project is going to be implementing bookmarks, and so that's what we will do in this lecture and the next one. Okay, and let's start again with a look at our flowchart here. And so in this video, what we will do is simply basically adding a handler to the recipe so that then the user can bookmark the recipe. And then that will re-render or update the recipe with the bookmark button then updated. And for doing that, there's actually a lot of stuff that we need to implement. So there's a lot of work for us to do. So let's get started. And actually, before we get started, I think we should actually also see this in action. So here in the demo version. So let's say that we are here on this first recipe. And when I click this recipe, I then want this icon here to change, right? And so this is now bookmarked. So when I then go to the next result, then of course this bookmark here is back to being empty. But when I go back to that recipe that I had bookmarked, then it is back to being filled. And so this means that the current recipe is indeed a bookmark. Then in the next lecture, we will take care of also displaying all the bookmarks up here. All right, but that's something different. And so for now, let's take care of the core functionality of being able to bookmark a recipe. Okay. And finally, there's one more thing that we actually need to do before starting that. So I discovered a small bug here. Let's say that we search for something and then we go to page 2 or page 3, for example. And then let's say we search for something else. So that gives us our results. But as we go back here, notice how we are still on page number 3. And so that is a bug that we need to fix. Now, can you figure out maybe on your own why this bug is happening? So I think that this would be a nice challenge for you to pause this video actually right now and try to figure out why this bug is happening. So hopefully you figured it out. And the reason for it is that here in the model, when we do the search, so here, when we load the search results, of course, the state is set to 1. So the page is set to 1 here automatically. However, as we move to another page, then this variable here gets updated, right? But then when we search for something else, we never reset this page to 1, right? And so that's what we have to do right here where we load the search results. So after this here, we need to say state.search.page and set it back to once. And so now whenever we load some new search results, so basically whenever we do a new search, then the page will reset to 1. So let's try that again now. So we are again at page 3. And you already see we have different results. And indeed, now we are at page number 1. Okay, so that was a small bug that needed to be fixed. But now let's go back to the actual topic of this video, which is to implement bookmarking. So bookmarks are all about data. And so we will start by working again in the model. And we will add a new method here, or actually a new function that we export that we will then use from the controller, which is simply add a bookmark. And so this will receive basically a recipe, and then it will set that recipe as a bookmark. So a recipe, and then in our state, we already have an array for bookmarks. Or actually we don't. But I think I had it in the architecture diagram. So anyway, we have an array of bookmarks which we start as an empty array, but then basically adding a bookmark simply means to push the recipe here into this array. Okay, so what I just said is this state.bookmarks.push and then the recipe object that we just received here. So let's add a comment here, add bookmark, because besides this, we also want to mark the current recipe as being bookmarked. So at least if the current recipe is the same recipe as this one that we are adding here. So mark current recipe as bookmark, because this will then allow us to actually display this current recipe as bookmarked in the recipe view. So we can say if recipe.id, so the ID of the recipe that we passed in here, is equal to the ID of the current recipe, so the one that is currently loaded in our application, which is state.recipe.id, while in this case we want to say state.recipe.bookmarked should be true. So basically setting a new property on this recipe object. So for now, that is the add bookmark function here. And so now let's create a new controller. So a controller for adding a new bookmark. So control add bookmark. And so here, let's now try to add a bookmark with the current recipe. So model.state.recipe. And then let's also immediately log that to the console so that we can see that it is actually marked as a bookmark. And now, of course, we need a way of calling this controller function. So when will that happen? Well, it should happen when we click on this button, right? So this bookmark button. And right now, the icon here is actually wrong. So let's start by fixing that here in the recipe view. So where is that? Here. So here it should not be fill. For now, it should simply be the empty icon like this. All right. Now the name of this button here is button round, but let's add another class here. So let's say button bookmark. And so now we want to listen for clicks on this element. However, to keep this view simple, I will not select this element. So at least not directly. And instead, I will once again do event delegation. So here let's add another function called addHandler. And here add bookmark, which as always will receive a handler function, which in this case is going to be the controller we just created a minute ago. So here, this dot parent element dot add event listener click and then our function here. And so in fact, this is really necessary because the element that we are trying to select, so this button with this class of button bookmark, does actually not exist by the time that the application is loaded, right? So basically by the time that the page starts, this element does not exist. And so it's impossible to add an event listener to an element that doesn't exist. And so that is yet another great use case for event delegation. So we do exactly what we do here, which is to simply listen for the event on a parent element and then try to figure out if the click actually happened on the element that we are looking for. So once again, we will do a button element here, and then e.target.closest, because one more time, the user might actually click on the icon element, so on the SVG that is in there. Okay, and if there is a button, or let's actually say if there is no button, then return, so the same guard clause as always, and otherwise call or handler. So this was pretty straightforward, I believe, because we have done this many times before. Okay, and so now all we have to do is in the controller module to call this method here, right? So recipe view dot add handler add bookmark, and then we pass in control add bookmark. And so then when we click the element that we just selected, then we will add the current recipe as a bookmark and will log also that current recipe to the console so that we can see that it was actually marked as bookmarked. Okay, so let's reload just to make sure. Let's click the button. And did anything happen? Oh, yeah, I think it just locked this object here. So let's see. And here we have it. So bookmarked is now set to true. Great. So an important piece of the work here is already done, but now we then want to render here this icon as filled. And so let's go back to our view and basically say if bookmarked is true, then render the filled icon, and if not, then simply render this one. So that should be easy enough. So not here in the view, of course, but in the recipe view where we generate the markup. So yeah, this is the button here, and this is the icon that I'm talking about. So here, when the recipe is bookmarked, we want to add like this fill part. And so we can simply say this dot data, which is the recipe, dot bookmarked. So if so, then here create a fill, and otherwise nothing. Okay, and now finally, to actually make this work, of course, we will also have to update the entire recipe. So recipe view, and so this is why we created that update method before. And so now again, this method is coming in very useful, because otherwise we would have to re-render the entire page, or actually the entire view, which wouldn't make a lot of sense. Because with this, we will only update the element which has actually changed. And so here then again, we need to pass in the data that we want to update. And so that's model.state.recipe once again. Okay, and so now as we click here, let's see, and indeed the button was updated. Now we get all of these logs here. Let's take them out. That is in the view. So that's this one here. Great. So here let's now search for something. So let's mark this one here as a bookmark, then this one here. But now as we come back here, let's see what happens. And you see that the bookmark is actually gone, right? So now here you no longer see bookmarked set to true. So why is that? Well, as we load each new recipe, it will always be loaded basically from scratch. So it will be loaded from the API, right? We are not loading this recipe from the bookmarks. And actually, we won't do that. But what we will do is to now use the data that we store in the bookmarks array in the state to basically mark any recipe that we load as bookmarked if it is already in the bookmarks array. So that probably sounded more complicated than it actually is. Okay, so let's go here back to the model and then to our function which loads the recipe. So that is this one. So here then, as we got all this data and store it in the state, then what we can do is to check if there is already a recipe with the same ID in the bookmark state. And if it is, then we will mark the current recipe that we just loaded from the API as bookmarked set to true. So let's use one of the nice array methods that we learned about, which is the sum method. And remember that the sum method returns true or false, and so that's great for doing an if check like this. So here we can check if state.bookmarks.sum, which basically means any, so at least that's how I like to think about this method. So this method will loop over an array and then return true if any of them actually has true for the condition that we specify here. So if bookmark.id is the same as the ID that we just received here. Okay, let's call this here bookmark actually. And so basically what this means is that if there is any bookmark which has the bookmark ID equal to the ID that we just received, well then we want the current recipe, which is state.recipe, to be bookmarked. So bookmark equal to true. Okay, and otherwise we want it set to false. And so with this, all the recipes that we now load will always have bookmarked set to either true or false. Okay, great. And so now we actually used this state.bookmarks for anything meaningful. So up until this point, we had stored the recipe in the bookmarks array, but it wasn't really useful. So there was really no point up until now. But now here we basically use this array in order to store all the bookmarks so that when we come back to one of them, we can then mark the recipe as being bookmarked. So let's try this now again. So bookmarking this, then I come to this, and yeah, so that worked. And you see that it is bookmarked set to true. And the previous one, so the double crust stuffed pizza, is of course bookmarked set to false. And so when we click that here, it doesn't have the bookmark. Now we bookmarked it, and when we come back to it, then there it is. Okay, and now just as the final piece here, when we click on this button again, we then want to unbookmark basically this recipe. So we want to remove it from the bookmarks. But right now, of course, that doesn't happen. And so what we need now is basically yet another method or function here in our model, which will simply remove a bookmark. So doing the opposite of add bookmark. So const delete bookmark. And this one will simply receive an ID because that is actually simpler. And this is actually a common pattern that you will see in programming. When we add something, we get the entire data. And when we want to delete something, we only get the ID. So this is a pretty common pattern again. So what we want to do here is to basically delete the recipe which has this ID from the bookmarks array. Right? So state.bookmarks, and then to delete something, we use the splice method. Remember? And then here we need the index where the element is actually located that we want to delete. So we will calculate the index in a second, and then how many items we want to delete, which is only one. And so this index here, we can calculate it by using our old friend defined index method. So state.bookmarks, and I think we already did something very similar to this in the Bankist application. So here we are looking for the element which has the ID equal to the ID that was passed in. So there's going to be one bookmark for which this condition here is true, so where the current bookmark.id is equal to this ID. And so for this element where this condition is true, the index will be returned. And then we can take that index and delete it from the array. And then finally, let's also mark the current recipe as not a bookmark anymore. So as not bookmarked, and here as well. And here, let's say delete bookmark. Okay. And now we need to, of course, use this function somewhere. And as always, that can only be in the controller. Okay. So this control@bookmark function will be executed whenever we click on that bookmark button. And so here we now need to control what exactly should happen in that case. So when do we actually want to add a bookmark? Well, actually only when the recipe is not yet bookmarked. So let's write that. So if model.state.recipe.bookmarked, so if that's false, then do this. So add the bookmark then. But if not, and so let's now do this instead of an else, because this is more readable, then we want to delete bookmark. And again, here we pass in actually the ID like this. And that's actually it. And this is possible, remember, so it's possible that we read the bookmarked property right at the beginning, because we add that to all the recipes that are ever loaded right at the beginning, right here. Okay? And so, yeah, this should now work. Let's try avocado now for a change. So some sushi here, that looks delicious. And we got ourselves a bug. So let's go to line number 8, 98 actually. So 98. Oh, and here we are using recipe.id because we simply copied it from here. So you see that simply copying some code many times can make us run into bugs. So here, of course, we are already receiving the ID. So that's only ID. Let's go back. And let's search for avocado again. So here we have that. Let's bookmark it. Well, that didn't work. Let's see why. So probably something wrong in our controller. So let's log this here to the console just to see if this is having any effect. Let's clear this here. And it is false. And so therefore this should have worked. But somehow nothing worked. So this code here did not get executed for some reason. Oh, and actually I see what is happening. So this code actually did get executed. So this code here will mark the recipe as bookmarked. But then in the next line of code, right here, then the recipe is already bookmarked. And so then it will delete that bookmark. And so here actually we need an else. Okay. So that's the kind of sometimes difficult bugs to find. but I'm sure that with time, you will also be able to find all of these bugs. So let's click on some recipe here, mark it as a bookmark. Then we go here to some other one, mark that. Then here, that is still working. And now let's click and see if it disappears. And yes, it does. Now do the same here, come back, and it is still unbookmarked. Whoa. All right. So with this, we have the core functionality of bookmarking actually already implemented. So great job once again. And now all that is missing is that we display all our bookmarks up here in this bookmarks panel. And that is a little bit more work than it might sound. And so let's leave that for our next video.